In December 1944, something happened in a small New Hampshire town that most people have never heard about. A decision was made in a conference room that would determine which country would dominate the world economy for the next 80 years. Britain walked into that room believing it was still the financial capital of the world. By the time they walked out, they had signed away their entire economic future to the United States. They did not know it yet, but the British Empire ended in that moment. Not on a battlefield, not in a colonial rebellion, but in a negotiation where Britain was forced to accept terms so devastating that their own diplomats wept when they read the final agreement. That conference was called Bretton Woods, and the choice Britain made there, the choice they felt they had no power to refuse, was the beginning of the end. But here is what terrifies me. In the last 3 years, America has made a nearly identical choice. We have chosen the exact same path that Britain took after Bretton Woods. We have made the same calculation, the same bet, the same tragic mistake. And if history is any guide, we are about to pay the same price Britain paid. Before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed because what I am about to show you is not being talked about anywhere else, and by the end of this video, you will understand why the next 5 years will determine whether America remains a superpower or becomes a cautionary tale. Let me take you back to 1944. World War II is still raging. Britain has been fighting for 5 years straight. Their cities are bombed. Their factories are running day and night producing weapons. Their young men are dying on battlefields across Europe and Asia, and they are completely, utterly, catastrophically broke. Britain had entered the war as one of the wealthiest nations on earth, but by 1944 they had spent everything. They had sold off their foreign investments. They had liquidated their gold reserves. They had borrowed billions from the United States under a program called Lend-Lease. The British Treasury calculated that they were losing financial reserves at a rate that would leave them unable to buy food within months. They were not just losing the economic war. They had already lost it. The only question was what would come next. The United States saw an opportunity. President Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors understood that whoever controlled the international financial system after the war would control the world. They were not going to let that power remain with Britain. So in July 1944, delegates from 44 countries gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Officially, they were there to design a new international monetary system that would prevent another Great Depression. In reality, they were there to witness the transfer of global economic power from London to Washington. Britain sent its most brilliant economist, John Maynard Keynes, to negotiate on their behalf. Keynes understood exactly what was happening. He proposed a system where no single country's currency would dominate. He wanted an international currency that would be fair to everyone, that would not give any nation the power to print money and force the world to accept it. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, rejected Keynes's plan completely. Instead, they proposed something radical. The US dollar would become the world's reserve currency. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every country that wanted to participate in international trade would have to hold dollars. Every central bank would have to keep dollar reserves. Every commodity would be priced in dollars. America would become the banker of the world. Keynes knew this was a terrible deal for Britain. He knew it would mean the end of the pound as a global currency. He knew it would give America financial power that no country had ever possessed. He fought against it. He argued. He pleaded. And then Britain's political leaders sent him a message. Accept the American terms. Britain had no choice. They needed American money to survive. They needed American loans to feed their population. They needed American support to maintain any influence in the post-war world. So Keynes gave up. He signed the agreement. And he reportedly told a colleague that he had just witnessed the end of Britain as a great power. Here is what that agreement actually meant. Before Bretton Woods, if France wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they could pay in francs, in pounds, in gold, or in any currency both parties accepted. After Bretton Woods, that same transaction had to go through dollars. France would have to convert francs to dollars, then use those dollars to buy oil, then Saudi Arabia would receive dollars. This created artificial demand for U.S. currency. It meant that America could print dollars, and the rest of the world would have to accept them because they needed dollars to function in the global economy. Britain, meanwhile, had to maintain a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. If the pound weakened, Britain had to spend its reserves to prop it up. If Britain ran a trade deficit, they could not just devalue their currency to fix it. They were locked into a system designed in Washington for Washington's benefit. The consequences became clear almost immediately. In 1945, the war ended. The Lend-Lease program that had been keeping Britain alive was abruptly canceled. John Maynard Keynes had to return to Washington, hat in hand, to beg for a loan. The Americans agreed to lend Britain $3.75 billion, but the terms were humiliating. Britain had to agree to make the pound convertible to dollars within 1 year. They had to promise to dismantle their system of imperial trade preferences. They had to open their colonial markets to American goods. Britain took the loan because the alternative was starvation. And with that loan came conditions that would systematically dismantle British economic power over the next decade. Let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the parallel to modern America becomes impossible to ignore. Britain spent the next 25 years trying to maintain two contradictory things at once. They tried to maintain a global military presence with bases and commitments all over the world, and they tried to maintain a currency that was fixed to the dollar at an artificially strong exchange rate. They could not afford both, but they refused to give up either one. Why? Because British leaders still thought of themselves as a great power. They still believed the empire meant something. They still wanted to sit at the table with America and the Soviet Union as an equal. So they kept spending money they did not have on a military they could not afford to maintain a status they had already lost. The costs were staggering. Britain spent enormous sums defending colonies that were demanding independence. They fought wars in Malaysia, Kenya, and Cyprus, trying to hold on to territories that no longer wanted British rule. They maintained a navy designed to patrol the entire world, even though they could barely afford to patrol their own coastline. And all the while, they had to keep the pound fixed to the dollar. Every time Britain ran a trade deficit, every time they imported more than they exported, their currency reserves would drain. They would have to go to the International Monetary Fund or the United States and ask for emergency loans. Each loan came with more conditions, more restrictions, more loss of sovereignty. By the 1960s, Britain was trapped in a doom loop. They were spending too much on the military, which drained their reserves, which forced them to borrow, which came with conditions that damaged their economy, which made it harder to afford the military, which meant they had to borrow more. Does any of this sound familiar yet? Let me connect the dots. Because modern America is in the exact same doom loop, and we walked into it by making the exact same choice Britain made at Bretton Woods. In 1971, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. America itself could no longer afford to keep the dollar pegged to gold. We had printed too many dollars. We had run too many deficits. Foreign central banks started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, and we were running out of gold. So, President Nixon did something extraordinary. He simply ended the convertibility of dollars to gold. He broke the promise that America had made at Bretton Woods. And here is the crazy part. It worked. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency anyway, not because it was backed by gold, but because the entire global system had been built around dollars. Every contract, every central bank reserve, every trade agreement assumed dollars. Changing would be too complicated, too expensive, too disruptive, so the world kept using dollars even after the gold backing disappeared. This gave America an incredible power. We could print unlimited amounts of money, and the world would accept it because they had no choice. We could run trade deficits forever because other countries needed to accumulate dollars to participate in the global economy. We could borrow at incredibly low interest rates because foreign governments bought our treasury bonds to hold as reserves. It was an extraordinary privilege. The French finance minister in the 1960s called it an exorbitant privilege, and he was right. But here is where America made Britain's mistake. Instead of using this privilege wisely, instead of building a sustainable economy, we did exactly what Britain did. We used our financial privilege to fund military adventures we could not afford. We maintained a global military presence that cost us over $800 billion per year. We fought wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that cost trillions and accomplished nothing. We stationed troops in over 80 countries and convinced ourselves this was necessary for our security. Meanwhile, we hollowed out our industrial base. We shipped our factories overseas. We stopped making things and started printing money instead. We ran trade deficits every single year, buying foreign goods with printed dollars, believing that the world would accept our currency forever. We made the exact same calculation Britain made in 1944. We chose military power and financial privilege over economic sustainability. And now, just like Britain, we are discovering that this choice has consequences. Let me show you exactly what is happening right now, in 2024 and 2025, that mirrors Britain's collapse. First, the military overreach. Britain bankrupted itself trying to police an empire. America is bankrupting itself trying to police the entire planet. We spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. We have troops stationed in countries that most Americans could not find on a map. We have committed to defending nations that provide us no strategic value. Every few years, we get involved in another conflict. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Each time we tell ourselves it will be quick and cheap. Each time it costs hundreds of billions and accomplishes nothing. Each time we borrow the money to pay for it. Britain did the exact same thing. They fought colonial wars they could not win, funded by debt they could not repay. Second, the currency problem. Britain tried to maintain the pound as a reserve currency while running persistent deficits. America is doing the identical thing with the dollar. Our trade deficit in 2024 exceeded $1 trillion. That means we imported $1 trillion more than we exported. We paid for those imports by creating new dollars. For decades, this worked because the world needed dollars. But that is changing. Fast. China and Russia now conduct most of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. The BRICS nations are actively building alternative payment systems that do not use dollars. Saudi Arabia, which has priced oil in dollars since 1974, is now accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. Each of these developments chips away at dollar demand, and as demand decreases, America's ability to print money without consequences decreases too. Third, and this is the big one, the debt spiral. Britain's national debt after World War II was over 250% of GDP. They spent decades trying to pay it down while also funding a global military. It nearly destroyed them. America's national debt just exceeded $36 trillion. That is 123% of GDP and rising fast. We added $2.3 trillion to the debt just this year. Our interest payments on that debt now exceed $1.1 trillion annually. Let me put that in perspective. We are spending more on interest payments than we spend on the entire Defense Department. We are spending more on interest than on Medicare. We are spending more on interest than on all non-defense discretionary spending combined. And it is getting worse. As interest rates rise, which they have to because inflation is not under control, the cost of servicing our debt rises too. Within 5 years, interest payments will be the single largest item in the federal budget. Britain hit this exact same point in the 1950s. They were spending so much on debt service that they could not afford basic government functions. They had to keep borrowing just to pay the interest on previous borrowing. Economists call this a debt spiral. And once you are in it, there are only 3 ways out. You can grow your economy fast enough to outgrow the debt. But America's growth rate has been declining for decades. You can massively cut spending. But no politician will touch Social Security, Medicare, or the military, which together make up over 70% of the budget. Or you can inflate away the debt by printing money and destroying your currency's value. Britain tried all 3. None of them worked. They still ended up in a crisis. America is running out of good options too. Now let me tell you about the specific choice that America made, the one that mirrors Britain's Bretton Woods decision, the one that locked us into this trajectory. In 2021 and 2022, the U.S. government made a decision that will be studied by historians for centuries. Faced with the economic disruption of COVID-19, faced with lockdowns and unemployment, faced with a potential depression, our government decided to do something unprecedented. They printed money on a scale never before seen in human history. In just 2 years, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by nearly $5 trillion. The government sent out stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment benefits, business loans, state and local funding, all of it funded by newly created money. At the time, we told ourselves it was necessary. We told ourselves it was temporary. We told ourselves the consequences would be manageable. We were wrong on all 3 counts. That decision to print trillions of dollars was our Bretton Woods moment. Just like Britain in 1944, we chose short-term survival over long-term sustainability. Just like Britain, we prioritized maintaining our standard of living over building a sound economy. Just like Britain, we assumed our privilege would last forever. The consequences are starting to show. Inflation surged to levels not seen in 40 years. Even now, after the Federal Reserve raised interest rates dramatically, prices are still 20 to 30% higher than they were in 2020. Wages have not kept pace. Real purchasing power has declined. The middle class is being squeezed. But the inflation is not even the worst part. The worst part is what that money printing did to global confidence in the dollar. Foreign central banks watched America create trillions of dollars out of thin air. They watched us debase our own currency to pay our bills. They watched us prove that when faced with a crisis, America will always choose the printing press over fiscal discipline. And they started making plans. China accelerated its efforts to internationalize the yuan. Russia sold off nearly all its treasury bond holdings. Middle Eastern oil producers started accepting other currencies. Europe began serious discussions about digital currency alternatives to the dollar. None of these moves alone will end dollar dominance, but together, they represent a slow-motion bank run. When central banks and foreign governments start quietly reducing their dollar exposure, when they start building alternative systems, when they start planning for a world where the dollar is not necessary, the end is inevitable. Britain faced the exact same thing in the 1960s. Foreign central banks started converting their pounds to dollars, quietly at first, then more rapidly. Each conversion reduced demand for pounds. Each reduction in demand made the pound weaker. Each weakening made Britain's debt more expensive to service. The spiral accelerated until Britain could no longer pretend. In November 1967, Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 14% overnight. The Prime Minister went on television and tried to claim that the pound in British pockets was still worth the same. Nobody believed him. The devaluation was an admission that Britain could no longer maintain its currency at the value it claimed. It was an admission of weakness, of decline, of reduced status. The empire had been living on borrowed time. The devaluation was the moment everyone stopped pretending. America's devaluation moment is coming. It might not look exactly like Britain's. We probably will not announce a formal devaluation, but the effect will be the same. At some point, the dollar will lose significant value against other currencies, against commodities, against real assets. At some point, foreign central banks will stop buying our debt. At some point, we will have a crisis where America tries to use its financial power and discovers that power no longer works. This could happen through several different paths. It could be a failed treasury auction where the government tries to sell bonds and cannot find enough buyers at acceptable interest rates. It could be a sanctions regime that pushes more countries into alternative payment systems. It could be a geopolitical crisis where America makes demands and other countries simply refuse because they no longer fear financial retaliation. It could be a domestic political crisis where Congress refuses to raise the debt ceiling and the world watches America default on its obligations. Any of these could be the trigger. And once it starts, the unwinding will be fast. Here is what Britain's experience teaches us about how fast things can change. In 1945, Britain was still considered one of the big three powers alongside America and the Soviet Union. By 1956, just 11 years later, Britain was taking orders from Washington. In 1950, the pound was still widely used as a reserve currency. By 1970, it was essentially irrelevant. In 1945, Britain had the world's largest navy. By 1970, they could barely afford to maintain a single aircraft carrier. The decline was not gradual. It was a series of sudden drops, crisis moments where Britain tried to maintain its status and was forced to back down. Each crisis revealed weakness. Each revealed weakness accelerated the next crisis. America is entering that same cascade. Our debt situation is worse than Britain's was. Our trade deficits are larger. Our manufacturing base is weaker. Our political system is more paralyzed. The only advantage we have is that the dollar is more deeply embedded in the global system than the pound ever was. But that is also our greatest vulnerability, because when the dollar loses its reserve status, when the world builds alternative systems, America will not gently decline into a comfortable middle power status. We will crash. Everything we import will become dramatically more expensive overnight. Gas, food, electronics, clothing, medicine, all of it will spike in price. Interest rates will soar because foreign buyers will stop purchasing treasury bonds. The government will have to either slash spending or print money to cover the gap. Either choice will be devastating. Our military, which depends on an $800 billion annual budget funded by borrowing, will have to shrink dramatically. We will not be able to afford bases in 80 countries. We will not be able to afford 11 aircraft carrier groups. We will have to choose between defending America itself and defending our far-flung commitments. Most of those commitments will be abandoned. America's ability to project power globally will evaporate within a decade, just like Britain's did. The comfortable American lifestyle, the abundance we take for granted, exists only because the world accepts our currency. When that ends, the lifestyle ends too. I know this sounds extreme. I know it sounds like doomerism. We can accept that we are no longer the sole superpower. We can focus on rebuilding our industrial base, on balancing our budget, on creating a sustainable economy. We can transition to a multipolar world where we are one important power among several, or we can do what Britain did. We can keep pretending, we can keep borrowing, we can keep printing money, we can keep stationing troops around the world and threatening sanctions and acting like the rules of economics do not apply to us. If we choose that path, we already know how it ends, because Britain showed us. Let me give you the specific warning signs to watch for, the signals that America's Bretton Woods reckoning is approaching. First, watch foreign central bank holdings of Treasury bonds. If you see a sustained, significant decrease, that is, central banks quietly exiting the dollar system. It happened to Britain in the 1960s. It is starting to happen to America now. Second, watch the premium on U.S. Treasury bonds. Right now, Treasury bonds are considered the safest asset in the world, so they trade at a premium. If that premium starts shrinking, if investors start demanding higher interest rates to hold American debt, that means confidence is cracking. Third, watch commodity pricing. Right now, most commodities are priced in dollars. If you start seeing major commodities being widely traded in other currencies, if you see oil or gold or wheat with prices quoted primarily in yuan or euros, that means the dollar's role is diminishing. Fourth, watch America's ability to enforce sanctions. We have used financial sanctions as a weapon for decades, but that weapon only works if the world uses our financial system. If you see sanctioned countries continuing to function, continuing to trade, continuing to access global markets through alternative systems, that means our financial power is gone. Fifth, watch for a crisis in treasury markets. If there is a moment when the U.S. government tries to auction bonds and cannot sell them all, if interest rates spike suddenly because buyers disappear, if the Federal Reserve has to step in and buy government debt directly because nobody else will, that is the endgame beginning. Any one of these could be the spark, or it could be something unexpected. Britain's Suez Crisis was not on anyone's prediction list. It was not the crisis economists warned about, but it was the crisis that revealed Britain's true position. America's revealing crisis is coming. It might be in 2026, it might be later, but it is coming, and we are not prepared. The question is what you do with this information. If you are an ordinary person, not a policymaker or a billionaire, what can you possibly do about the dollar's decline? I am not telling you to panic. I am telling you to prepare. Understand that America's dominance is not a law of nature. It is a temporary condition maintained by specific economic arrangements. Those arrangements are breaking down. The empire we built after Bretton Woods is ending, just like the British Empire ended after its Bretton Woods moment. You cannot stop this. I cannot stop this. The trajectory is already locked in, but you can protect yourself and your family from the worst of it. Learn real skills, build real relationships, acquire real assets, get out of debt, reduce your dependence on systems that assume American prosperity will continue forever, and pay attention. Watch the warning signs. Do not let normalcy bias convince you that because things have been stable for your whole life, they will remain stable. Britain was stable for a century until suddenly it was not. The final thing I want to say is about responsibility. Britain's decline was not inevitable. It was chosen. British leaders made decisions at Bretton Woods, and after that prioritized pride over pragmatism. They chose to maintain appearances instead of building strength. America's decline is not inevitable either. It is being chosen. Every year we run trillion-dollar deficits. Every year we add to our military commitments. Every year we print money instead of building things. Every year we pretend the math does not matter. We are choosing Britain's path. The American people deserve to understand this choice. We deserve to know that when our leaders promise tax cuts and new programs, when they promise to maintain our global military presence, when they promise that America will remain dominant, they are making promises that cannot be kept. We deserve to know that we are repeating history, that the empire is making the same mistakes every empire makes, that our Bretton Woods moment already happened and we made the wrong choice. Britain lost its empire with the choice it made in 1944, a choice to take American loans with devastating conditions rather than accept a reduced role in the world. America made its choice in 2021, a choice to print trillions of dollars rather than accept the economic consequences of our decisions. Both choices bought time. Both choices felt necessary in the moment. Both choices guaranteed eventual collapse. The only question now is how long until the bill comes due. Subscribe if you want to understand what is coming, because the next few years will determine whether America manages a controlled decline or a chaotic collapse, and most people will not see it coming until it is too late.